Did you know that before there was an official Israeli army, there were actually 3 underground Jewish militias? Yeah, they were the Haganah, the Irgun, and the Lehi. They all had competing ideologies, and sure, they fought common enemies like the British and the Arabs, but their fiercest enemies were often each other. Now, these fights between the Haganah, the Irgun, and the Lehi weren't your family's Seder table squabbles. This was Jew against Jew with life and death consequences in the future Jewish state. By the way, we're talking about the period between the late 1930s and mid-1940s when Nazi Germany was taking over Europe and the number of Jewish victims continued to rise. But despite their disagreements, the Jews comprising these militias did all have something in common: Zionism. They were all desperate to achieve the dream of a Jewish state. Where they disagreed was on how to achieve the dream. So, who were these militias? Why did they briefly put aside their differences to join forces, and why did they ultimately disband? Now, to better understand the different powers in play prior to Israeli independence in 1948, let's briefly talk about Zionism, the movement to establish a Jewish state. Today, the word alone can send a room into a frenzy. That isn't a new phenomenon, even amongst fellow Zionists. But it's important to know that Zionism isn't and never has been monolithic. It has different flavors. Think of eating pizza. There's different ways to do it. You can pick it up, you can fold it, you can eat with a fork and knife, but at the end of the day, it's still eating pizza. So it's the same with Zionism. Different ideas, but still Zionism. But as an aside, if you eat pizza with a fork and knife, I think we need to talk. Anyway, these different strands of Zionism are what inspired the competing military factions we're going to talk about. We're gonna pick things up in the 1920s when we had Jews and Arabs living under British colonial control in modern-day Israel. Quick history lesson: what is now modern-day Israel was colonized by the British from 1923 to 1948. It was called the British Mandate of Palestine, or simply the British Mandate for our purposes. At the time, the mainstream strand of Zionism was socialist Zionism, whose followers believed that achieving a state would require working diplomatically with other countries, namely Great Britain. Sounds simple enough, right? David Ben-Gurion, the leader of mainstream Zionism and Israeli founding father, #NotJustAnAirport, and the overall establishment believed in this idea. But socialist Zionists were still realists and saw the value in having a military. So in 1921, in response to spreading Arab violence against Jews and the British Mandate, these social Zionists established the Haganah, an illegal underground army. I know, a legal underground army sounds pretty badass. But the Haganah was really established more out of necessity, simply to provide protection to Jewish settlements. It practiced a policy of havlaga, or restraint, and didn't go full paramilitary or launch attacks. A loose organization made up of local defense groups, Haganah leaders favored the long game of diplomacy with the British in hopes of eventually establishing a Jewish state. Fighters were instructed to only defend Jewish communities, not incite violence against the Arabs or the British. But some Haganah commanders protested this policy of restraint. I'm looking at you, Vladimir Jabotinsky. Basically, Jabotinsky, one of the Haganah's original leaders and founders, fathered a splinter movement from socialist Zionism known as revisionist Zionism that gained prominence in the latter half of the 1920s as Arab violence against the Jewish community picked up. Spurred on by Jabotinsky, these revisionist Zionists felt social Zionists were too weak and passive in the face of British rule and Arab oppression. After particularly bad bouts of Arab riots against Jewish settlements in 1929, 31, and 37, fed-up Haganah commanders, led by Jabotinsky, launched a rival militia called the Irgun, dedicated to armed struggle against the British and the Arabs. Not too long after, the British implemented something called the White Paper of 1939, which dictated their official government policy in the British Mandate. 1939? Something else important happened that year? Anyone? Only the Second World War broke out. So just when things were getting really, really bad for the Jews in Europe, right when they needed to get out the most, the White Paper strictly limited Jewish immigration to the British Mandate. In doing so, the White Paper only exacerbated the divide between the Haganah and the Irgun. Now in theory, socialist and revisionist Zionists, the strands that made up the Haganah and the Irgun, weren't all that different. They actually agreed on quite a bit, including opposing everything about the White Paper. Both believed in the establishment of Jewish settlements in pre-state Israel, the right to a Jewish armed forces, and more Jewish immigration, all accomplished ideally through diplomacy with the British. But where they disagreed was to what degree they might be willing to use force, if need be, to achieve those goals. But what did that look like? Well, with the Second World War raging in Europe, Ben-Gurion and the establishment pledged support to the British in their fight against a common enemy, the Nazis. They still favored the path of diplomacy, although they voiced their displeasure with the British policies like the White Paper. The Irgun, on the other hand, sneered at the Haganah philosophy of restraint. They continued fighting the British despite the war effort, taking their marching orders directly from Jabotinsky and eventually Menachem Begin, who arrived in the early 1940s. They intimidated merchants, extorted money, and even blew up British immigration and tax offices. Ben-Gurion reviled the Irgun, referring to its members as a harmful, destructive gang. He feared Irgun-led revolt would bring down the wrath of the European power on Jews in the British Mandate. Think the Irgun sounds intense? Well, meet the Lehi, also known as the Stern Gang, and the third armed Zionist underground organization we'll talk about. Soon after the outbreak of the Second World War, the Irgun adopted a temporary truce with the British, essentially ending its violence against them. It was a move that, surprise, surprise, some Jews didn't like. So yet another splinter group took shape in 1940 when Abraham Stern, an Irgun commander, created the Lehi. The Lehi was a radical organization carrying out extreme operations, even political assassinations, against the British. Both the Irgun and the Lehi were motivated by the same thing, ripping up the White Papers. In fact, Lehi was so desperate that early on during the Second World War, prior to the Nazi final solution, they actually attempted to coordinate with the fascist Italians and the Nazis to circumnavigate British limitations on Jewish immigration and get European Jews out safely. They actually viewed the Axis powers as lesser enemies than the British. Yeah, you heard that right. I mean, there's the whole my enemy's enemies thing, and then there's that. Think about that for a second. Some pre-state Zionists tried to coordinate with Hitler to save Jews. That's pretty crazy. No doubt, revolution in the face of a heavyweight colonial power is a messy, messy business. And just like the Haganah and the Irgun, the Lehi thought they were doing what needed to be done. However, the Lehi was seen by most Jews at the time as dangerous and illegitimate. Establishment figures, your Ben-Gurions, your Golda Meirs, with close ties to the British who had hopes of leveraging that relationship, viewed the Irgun and the Lehi as threats to diplomatic efforts. In fact, they thought the Haganah's two rival militias were so problematic that Meir proposed destroying them. Yeah, she actually said that, even adding that she had, quote, no moral constraints about the notion. When Ben-Gurion replied that they couldn't shoot Jews in the land of Israel, Golda Meir responded, quote, we have to do everything to make them stop in this work. Everything. Cutthroat, Golda. Cutthroat. And this wasn't just talk. In 1944, the Lehi's assassination of Lord Moyne, the British Minister of State in the Middle East and BFF with Winston Churchill, was the last straw. Between November 1944 and March 1945, with Ben-Gurion's approval, the Palmach, the Haganah's elite fighting unit, searched out members of the Irgun and the Lehi and handed them over to the British. This was known as the hunting season. Why? Well, when the Haganah arrested and turned in fellow Jews to the British, they knew full well they might be condemning them to the gallows. During the hunting season, Begin, now the undisputed Irgun leader after Jabotinsky's death in 1940, refused to fight against the Haganah, against fellow Jews, despite being targeted by them. Ben-Gurion and Meir weren't so idealistic. But then something changed. With the end of World War II in the fall of 1945, strict limits on Jewish immigration became something Zionist establishment figures like Ben-Gurion could no longer tolerate, and the British showed no signs of easing up. Sure, they never liked the White Paper policies, but with the end of the Holocaust and so many Jewish refugees in post-war Europe needing a safe haven, abolishing limits on Jewish immigration to the British Mandate became paramount. Enough was finally enough. And so, with the three militias wanting to ensure unrestricted Jewish immigration to the British Mandate, their leaders took on Ma'avak, or the struggle. Now, this was no small feat. After all the friction and double-crossing between their ranks, the Haganah, the Irgun, and the Lehi joined forces and put their differences aside to attack British infrastructure. Beginning in the fall of 1945, a remarkable show of unity amongst these armed Zionist organizations ensued, shedding light on the Zionist cause. Together, they formed Tnuat HaMeri HaIvri, which has been loosely translated as the United Resistance Movement. Let's call it the URM for short. Ben-Gurion and the Haganah had veto power over decisions and led many successful URM attacks on strategic points. This included sabotaging railway tracks, sinking British patrol ships, taking out radar installations used to detect the incoming flow of Jewish immigrants by sea, and isolating the British by blowing up bridges that connected the British Mandate to neighboring Syria, Lebanon, and Jordan. In response, the British unleashed Black Sabbath, a harrowing assault on Jewish communities and cities from Jerusalem to Tel Aviv, in which citizens were placed on lockdown. More than 17,000 British soldiers searched for Zionist militants and confiscated important documents. Now, remember those documents. Amidst the turmoil, Chaim Weizmann, future first president of Israel, declared, "What did you expect? That you blow up trains and the British will give you honey cakes?" He demanded an end to the violent revolt against the British. Simultaneously, actual pogroms were still happening in post-war Europe. While Black Sabbath was happening in the British Mandate, 42 Jews were brutally murdered in a pogrom in Kielce, Poland. Despite the Holocaust being over, Jews still felt ignored, cornered, and feared they were running out of options. Worse still, they couldn't agree on the best course of action. Now, one course of action that Irgun leaders had discussed in years past was bombing the landmark King David Hotel in Jerusalem, home to the British headquarters in the area. They believed that striking such a main artery would deal a devastating blow to the British and further the Zionist cause. The Haganah had previously always nixed the idea, but after Black Sabbath, the Haganah gave its blessing. Why? Remember those documents the British confiscated during Black Sabbath? Well, Haganah leaders believed they contained incriminating evidence linking the likes of Ben-Gurion, Meir, and the Jewish Agency to the Haganah, which was still illegal until 1948. Irgun leaders also feared that the documents could lead to retribution against their ranks. So the Irgun, with the stamp of approval from Moshe Sneh, the head of the Haganah, planned the bombing. Just 2 days before, the Haganah and the Lehi actually backed out, but the Irgun was undeterred and decided to go for it, ultimately planting bombs in the hotel's basement on July 22, 1946. Warning phone calls were placed to the hotel to try and allow occupants time to leave. But inexplicably, hotel guests were only warned about 25 minutes in advance. In the end, 91 people were killed in the attack. Ben-Gurion and the Haganah falsely denied any involvement. Meir expressed ostensibly genuine shock and remorse. Most reports indicate that she actually knew nothing about the planned attack prior. The bombing effectively ended the period of Zionist kumbaya and the URM. The loss of innocent life also highlighted the controversial tactics of the three joined militias. Shortly thereafter, they ceased working together, and the Irgun and the Lehi resumed their own operations in defiance of the Haganah. But let's not diminish the importance of what happened. For 10 months, pre-state Zionists rallied under one banner, something that seemed highly improbable before the end of the Second World War. This was a critical period, and it showed the British and the rest of the international community how much establishing a Jewish state meant to the Jewish people. After the Holocaust, when the world closed its doors to the Jews, they needed a safe haven, and that safe haven was Israel. This time of unity was a precursor to the unity that would be needed to fight the Arabs during the 1948 Israeli-Arab War. Despite all of the intense infighting, the questionable methods, the backstabbing, and betrayal, these pre-state militias were able to put aside their differences and fight together. The Haganah, the Irgun, and the Lehi all took the fight to the British. But you could argue that it was a dirty fight. Did obtaining the Zionist dream come at the expense of Jewish morals? And should out-and-out diplomacy have been given more of a chance? What do you think?